Hey, thanks again for checking us out. My name's Jim Smith, and we are going through the book of Romans. And today we're just looking at a question about those Old Testament laws. Do we really have to obey those Old Testament laws? You know, we got some Old Testament kind out laws in California that are still in the books. I read some of these crazy things. Here, it is illegal to store anything except cars in a garage in Long Beach, still in the books. In the city of Blythe, California, out there in the desert along the Colorado River, it says that people in Blythe, it's illegal to wear cowboy boots unless you own two cows. It's true. So in Chico, California, there's also a law on the books that it is illegal to detonate nuclear devices within the city limits. I'm glad they have that rule in Chico, California. There's some interesting rules in the Old Testament too. A lot of people look at those and say, do I have to obey those laws? Like, I can't eat pork, can't eat shrimp, can't wear any clothing that has two types of material woven uh, in the shirt or a garment. Do I have to follow those laws? What's with all those laws? Well, Paul says in Romans chapter 7, he starts out, now, dear brothers and sisters, you who are familiar with the law. And we're not always familiar with the Jewish laws, but they were. And so he just said, hey, you're familiar with these. And here's what they were. There were ceremonial laws, there were civil laws, and there were moral laws. And the ceremonial laws, they had certain things that they had to do. That's been put away. That's been ruled obsolete. And then also the civil laws, how to conduct yourself according to this nation that God carved out, those have been rendered obsolete because Jesus came and created something new. But the moral laws still are there, and that's been passed on to us. So Tim Keller writes this: in short, the coming of Christ changed how we worship, but not how we live. The moral law outlines God's own character, his integrity, love, and faithfulness. And so everything the Old Testament says about loving our neighbor, caring for the poor, generosity with our possessions, social relationships, and commitment to our family is still in force. The New Testament continues to forbid killing or committing adultery, and all the sexual ethics of the Old Testament is restated throughout the New Testament. If the New Testament has reaffirmed a commandment, this is still in force today. So the moral laws are still in force today. They're repeated. And so Paul goes on and says, you are living under grace. He goes back to what he said in Romans chapter 6. He said, we live under grace. You no longer live under the requirements of the law, those civil and ceremonial laws. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace. So we now, living under grace, have liberty instead of legalism. In verse 2, he says, we're released from the law. In verse 4, it kind of gives an idea that relationship with God now is utmost important. Instead of following all the rules, we belong to another. He says we belong to Jesus Christ. We've died with him. We've been raised with him. We have a relationship with Jesus instead of trying to follow all these rules, hoping for a relationship. He says, I wouldn't have known that I was sick, but now I know I am sick, but Jesus is my cure because he can take away my sins. And so those Old Testament laws, except for the moral laws, have been set aside, but the moral laws continue. But then Paul goes on in chapter 13, and we're jumping ahead, but he says, here's how you need to live. You need to be governed by love. And Paul says in Romans 13, so love fulfills the requirement of God's law. It's all about love. See, the law showed that we are sinful. We have this natural tendency to sin, those old laws, because they show the character of God, what God demands of us, but it's impossible for us to fulfill all the requirements of the law. Just impossible. So Jesus says, I'll die for your sins. And now I want to have a relationship with you to help you live a full and complete life. But here's the commandments that Jesus gives us in the New Testament. Paul reminds us of this. And Jesus said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commands. There you have it. So Paul is writing in chapter 7 just saying, listen, you got to be governed by love now. You don't have to follow all those laws. You can eat shrimp and pork. Yeah, you have to follow the moral laws. Homosexuality is still wrong. Adultery is still wrong. Murder, stealing, lying, still wrong. But I've forgiven you of your sins. Now go out and live an abundant life and love one another. Be an example this week, wherever you go, of someone who loves God and someone who loves others. And you're learning as you're growing. Have a great week. Bye-bye.